April 14, 1945. Weimar, Germany. 6:47 a.m. A German Stuka dive bomber explodes on the tarmac, its fuel tank rupturing in a column of orange fire that punches 60 feet into the cold morning sky. Burning wreckage skids across the cracked concrete, scattering like broken teeth across a graveyard of twisted metal and collapsed hangars. American soldiers don't even flinch. They've seen 1,000 things burn in the last 3 years. They just keep walking, rifles, slung boots, crunching over glass and ash because there is work to do. There are prisoners to process. There is a war to finish. But on this particular morning, inside a makeshift prisoner compound, carved out of a shattered German airfield, something unusual is about to happen. Something that has nothing to do with tanks or artillery or aerial bombardment. It's going to involve one man, a monocle, and the most dangerous thing a defeated soldier can carry into captivity, his pride. His name was Friedrich von Allendorf, Oberleutnant, Wehrmacht. A man who, even with the Reich crumbling beneath his feet, had not yet received the message that the world had changed around him. And the man who was going to deliver that message, George S. Patton, commander of the U.S. Third Army. The most feared general the Germans had ever faced on the Western Front. What happened between these two men in that muddy prisoner cage would take less than 15 minutes. But every soldier who witnessed it would remember it for the rest of their lives. Because it wasn't just a confrontation between a general and a prisoner. It was the moment an entire ideology finally ran out of ground to stand on. By April of 1945, the numbers told a story so brutal, it was almost difficult to comprehend. The Wehrmacht, once the most powerful military machine in human history, had lost over 5 million men on the Eastern Front alone. Another 500,000 had been killed, wounded, or captured in the 11 months since D-Day. The 1,000-year Reich had been reduced to a shrinking perimeter of rubble and desperation. German cities were unrecognizable. Dresden had been firebombed into ash. Berlin was surrounded. Hitler was underground in a concrete bunker issuing orders to armies that no longer existed. Patton's Third Army had driven over 1,000 miles across France, Luxembourg, and Germany in less than 10 months. Tanks, infantry, artillery, moving at a pace that defied military logic. Patton had relieved Bastogne. Patton had crossed the Rhine. Patton was now deep inside Germany itself, and the Wehrmacht soldiers falling into American hands were a shadow of the force that had terrified Europe in 1940. They came in waves. Teenagers conscripted from high schools. Factory workers handed rifles and told to fight. Old men who had never expected to see combat being marched into prisoner cages with their hands behind their heads. The processing centers were overwhelmed. Miles of barbed wire. Thousands of prisoners per day. American soldiers working through cold spring rain, clipboards in hand, recording names, ranks, units, weapons. Most German soldiers cooperated. They were exhausted, hungry, relieved it was over. Some openly wept. Others stared at the ground in silence, absorbing the reality of what had happened to the country they had given everything for. The Wehrmacht's reputation for iron discipline had not survived the total collapse of the front. Men who had once goose-stepped through Paris were now standing in muddy pens waiting to be catalogued. But not all of them had accepted the new reality. Not yet. Friedrich von Allendorf had been an officer for 16 years. He had served in Poland, France, and the Eastern Front. He had survived Stalingrad's outer perimeter. He had received decorations. He had commanded men. In the world he had inhabited for his entire adult life, rank was not merely an administrative designation. It was the architecture of existence. An officer was an officer was an officer. That hierarchy did not dissolve because a battle was lost. It did not dissolve because the front had moved. It did not dissolve because you were standing behind American barbed wire in the rain. Or so he believed. When the American sergeant walked into the compound that morning to begin processing, he saw Allendorf immediately. The man was impossible to miss. Every other prisoner was slumped, hunched, withdrawn, the physical vocabulary of defeat. But Allendorf stood in the center of the enclosure like a flagpole. Spine rigid. chin elevated. Silver oak leaves on his collar still polished. Monocle gleaming. Hands clasped behind his back like he was waiting to conduct an inspection, not be processed as a prisoner of war. The sergeant called out, "Step forward." The line began to move. Everyone stepped forward, except one man. Allenorf did not move. He reached into his coat pocket, removed a pair of gloves, and began with extraordinary deliberateness to brush mud from his sleeve. The sergeant called again. Still nothing. And then, Allenorf spoke loud enough for the entire compound to hear. Clear, crisp German translated by the unit interpreter standing at the gate. "I will not present myself like a common enlisted prisoner." The compound went rigid. Even the rain seemed to pause. The sergeant's jaw tightened. He told the man he was a prisoner of war. He told him the rules were simple. Step forward. Allenorf turned slightly, studying the American, with the particular contempt of a man who believed in hierarchies so deeply that their absence genuinely confused him. "In the German army," he said, "an officer of my rank does not answer to a sergeant." The sergeant did not escalate. He did not shout. He turned to the nearest MP and said 3 words. "Go get the colonel." Then he paused, reconsidered, and said, "Actually, go get the general." Patton was in the command tent when the MP arrived. The Third Army's operational map covered the entire folding table, red lines cutting deep into German territory. The general was reviewing movement orders for the push toward Pilsen when the private knocked and entered. He stood at attention and reported what was happening 50 yards away behind the wire. A captured Wehrmacht lieutenant colonel was refusing to be processed, was demanding to be treated according to his rank, was standing in a prisoner compound telling American sergeants that he did not take orders from their kind. Patton set down his pencil. He looked at the MP for a moment with an expression that was impossible to read. Then he picked up his gloves, adjusted his helmet, and walked out of the tent. There are certain men whose presence physically changes a room, or, in this case, a muddy compound. When Patton pushed through the gate, the transformation was immediate and total. The American guard straightened. The MPs tightened. Even the German prisoners, who had no idea who this broad-shouldered general was, could feel the air change. He moved with the absolute certainty of a man who had not experienced a single day of self-doubt in 30 years of military service. Twin ivory-handled revolvers on his belt. Jaw set like concrete. Eyes scanning the compound with the sharp efficiency of a man who processed tactical information the way most people breathe. He found Allenorf in 4 seconds. He walked directly to him. He stopped 2 feet away. He looked the German officer up and down. Mud-spattered coat, polished monocle, that improbable posture. And then Patton said, in a voice carrying the collected authority of a man who had broken the spine of 3 German army groups, "Which one of you is the officer who thinks he's still in charge?" Allenorf did not flinch. He stepped forward, the first voluntary step he had taken since the sergeant arrived, and he introduced himself by name and rank. And then he said, chin elevated, "I demand to be treated with the proper respect due to my rank." The rain tapped against 500 helmets. Nobody breathed. Patton looked at the German officer for a long moment. Then his expression did something unexpected. It shifted not to anger, but to something almost like amusement. He removed his gloves slowly. He looked past Allenorf at the line of exhausted, filthy German prisoners stretching across the compound behind him. He looked back, and he began to speak, not in a shout, not in a rage. Patton, in this moment, was cold and surgical and devastating in the way that only a man completely confident in his position can be. He pointed toward the horizon beyond the burning airfield. He talked about direction. He talked about momentum. He told Allenorf that his army had been running west for months while Patton's army had been running east. He told him that the monocle and the oak leaves and the rigid posture were not going to rearrange the fundamental facts of the situation. He told him that there was exactly one rank that mattered inside this compound, and it was the rank currently standing in front of him with ivory revolvers and zero patience. Allenorf pushed back. He cited the Geneva Convention. He spoke about dignity. He said that he was still an officer. And with each response, Patton calmly, methodically dismantled the argument, not with rage, but with something far more powerful. Reality. Blunt, specific, unanswerable reality. Your army lost. Your tanks are burning. Your 1,000-year empire is collapsing block by block. Your soldiers are standing behind wire waiting to be fed by the people who just destroyed you, and you are going to step forward and be processed. The 5-second ultimatum came quietly. No shouting, no drama. Just the calm voice of a man who had never once in his military career made a threat he did not intend to keep telling a defeated officer that cooperation was no longer optional. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The monocle came out first. Allenorf removed it carefully, looked at it for a moment, and slipped it into his coat pocket. And then something happened that 500 men would remember for the rest of their lives. His shoulders dropped. Not much. Maybe half an inch. But in that compound on that morning, it was like watching a building settle into its foundation. The posture that had defined Friedrich von Allenorf for 16 years of military service simply released. He walked to the processing table. He gave his name. He gave his unit. He handed over his wallet and his lighter and his folded map. He placed the monocle into the canvas sack. The MP tied it shut, and when Patton called him back for one final exchange, not to humiliate him, but to say something he needed to say, the German officer listened. "In my army," Patton told him, gesturing to the American guard standing in the rain. "Rank means responsibility." He looked at the prisoners. "In yours it meant privilege." He said it without cruelty. He said it like a man reading a sentence from a history book that had already been written. Then he sent the man to the officer section of the compound and walked back toward the gate. Behind him, the tension in the compound dissolved like smoke. Processing resumed. The rain kept falling. Somewhere beyond the ruined airfield, artillery continued to rumble toward Berlin. The war had less than 4 weeks left. But something had ended in that muddy compound long before the surrender papers were signed. The idea that the structures men build to organize power can survive the collapse of the power itself. Von Allenorf had carried his rank like a weapon, and Patton had shown him quietly and without mercy that a weapon only works when the other side agrees to be afraid of it. In that muddy compound near Weimar, General George S. Patton had just dismantled the last defense of a defeated officer, not with artillery, but with 3 sentences of cold surgical truth. Friedrich von Allenorf had finally stepped forward. The monocle was in a canvas sack. The war for one arrogant lieutenant colonel was officially over. But for Patton, something far larger was just beginning. Because 50 miles east of that prisoner compound, the Third Army's lead tanks were sitting idle on the banks of the Mulde River. Engines running, fuel in the tanks, roads open ahead, and a direct order from Supreme Allied Headquarters telling them not to move a single inch further. The same man who had just forced a captured German officer to face reality was about to slam face first into a wall of political reality himself. And this wall would not yield to 5-second ultimatums. Here is what the history books rarely emphasize with the weight it deserves. By April 14, 1945, Patton's Third Army was positioned to drive straight to Berlin. The German defensive line between the Mulde River and the German capital had effectively collapsed. American armored columns had been averaging 40 miles per day. Intelligence reports confirmed that Wehrmacht resistance in the corridor to Berlin was fragmented, disorganized, and collapsing by the hour. Soviet forces were still fighting through the outer defensive rings of Berlin, taking catastrophic casualties in brutal urban combat. By conservative military estimates, Patton's armor could have reached Berlin in 72 hours, possibly less. He knew it. His corps commanders knew it. His tank crews knew it. And Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower had just ordered the entire American advance to halt at the Elbe River. Permanently. The order had come through SHAEF Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force on April 15th. Eisenhower's reasoning was documented political, and to Patton's mind, an act of strategic madness that would haunt the Western world for the next half-century. The Yalta Conference agreements, signed in February, had divided post-war Germany into occupation zones. Berlin fell within the designated Soviet zone. Pushing American forces into Soviet-designated territory risked diplomatic catastrophe. Eisenhower had decided the political cost outweighed the military prize. Patton received the order in his command tent. He read it once, twice, set it down. Then he walked outside and stood in the cold April air for a long moment, staring east toward a horizon he had been racing toward for 10 months. He had one word for it. Several of those words cannot be repeated here. The confrontation happened the following morning. Patton drove to 12th Army Group headquarters and stood across a map table from General Omar Bradley, his immediate superior, a man he had known for 30 years and respected genuinely. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. It was not quiet. "Brad," Patton said, pressing both hands flat on the map. "Give me the go-ahead, and I'll drive to Berlin in 3 days. 3 days, while the Soviets are bleeding out street by street." Bradley looked at the map. He looked at Patton. His voice was steady. "George, it's not my call. It came from Ike. It came from the combined chiefs. The zone agreements were made at Yalta. We push into Soviet territory, we're not just starting a new military problem, we're starting a diplomatic catastrophe." Diplomatic catastrophe. Patton said the words like they tasted wrong. "Brad, the Soviets are going to take Berlin. They're going to take Vienna. They're going to take Prague. And when this war ends, they're going to be sitting on everything east of the Elbe with their hand out saying thank you very much." He tapped the map hard. "We have the fastest army in the world right now with open road ahead of it, and we're stopping." Bradley's jaw tightened. "Those are your orders, George. Those are political orders. All orders are political at some level." Patton stared at him. Then he picked up his gloves and walked out. But he wasn't done. Not remotely. He began lobbying upward through every channel available to him. Memoranda to SHAEF. Direct communications to Eisenhower. He made the military case with the precision of a surgeon. Soviet forces would sustain between 70,000 and 100,000 casualties, taking Berlin in direct urban combat. American armor arriving from the West could achieve the same objective at a fraction of the cost in lives, American and Soviet. The strategic argument was unimpeachable. Every number supported it. Every tactical reality supported it. SHAEF did not move. What Patton did not fully grasp or perhaps understood, but refused to accept, was that the obstacle was no longer military. The agreements at Yalta were already written. Churchill had signed them. Roosevelt had signed them. The boundary lines on the post-war map of Europe had been drawn in ink months before Patton's tanks ever reached the Mulde. No memorandum from a 3-star general was going to redraw them. He was being stopped not by an enemy army, but by a conference table. Not by German resistance, but by Allied politics. And for a man who had spent his entire career believing that speed, aggression, and overwhelming force were the answers to every military problem, this was a category of obstacle he had no weapon for. Then, something unexpected happened. Brigadier General William Hogue, commander of the 4th Armored Division and one of the most respected combat officers in the European theater, quietly walked into Patton's command tent on the evening of April 16th. Hogue had been the man who captured the Remagen Bridge intact, one of the most consequential battlefield decisions of the entire Western campaign. When Hogue spoke, people listened. He sat down across from Patton. He didn't waste words. "General, I've looked at the intelligence from the Prague corridor." He spread a map on the table. "Berlin may be closed, but Prague isn't." His finger traced a line southwest. "Czech resistance has been active for weeks. If the Soviets reach Prague before us, we lose the only major Central European capital we still have a chance to take. and the political situation in Czechoslovakia becomes permanent. He paused. Eisenhower's halt order specifies the Elbe boundary in the north and center. The southern boundary is less defined. There's room here. Patton looked at the map for a long time. The room was completely silent. Outside, rain tapped against the canvas. Somewhere far to the east, artillery rumbled in the continuous low register that had been the soundtrack of the last 10 months. "How much room?" Patton said finally. "Enough," Hogue said. The plan was straightforward and required no violation of the explicit halt order. The Third Army would push south and southeast through Bavaria, eliminating remaining German resistance, and drive hard for Czechoslovakia. The military rationale was sound significant. Wehrmacht forces remained in the area and required neutralization. The political dimension was understood but unspoken. Whoever reached Prague first would shape the post-war political reality of Central Europe. Patton put the plan in motion within 48 hours. On April 18th, the Third Army resumed its advance, not toward Berlin, toward Bavaria, Austria, and the Czech border. The movement was rapid, violent, and precisely coordinated. 3 corps, thousands of vehicles, hundreds of tanks driving southeast through terrain that German commanders had believed would slow American armor considerably. It did not slow American armor considerably. Within 72 hours, the Third Army had destroyed or captured 3 separate German infantry divisions and liberated the first of the Nazi concentration camps at Ohrdruf. What Patton's soldiers found there, and what Patton himself witnessed on April 12, just days before, had affected him in a way that no battle ever had. He had ordered German civilians from nearby towns to walk through the camp and see what their country had done. He had stood in that camp and felt something that even 30 years of war had not produced in him. He had gone outside and been physically sick. The camps were everywhere now. As the Third Army pushed southeast, they kept finding them. Buchenwald, Flossenburg. The numbers emerging from these places were numbers that did not fit inside any human framework for comprehension. Not thousands, hundreds of thousands, and behind every number a person, a name, a life that had been systematically extinguished by the same regime whose lieutenant colonels were standing in prisoner cages demanding to be addressed by their rank. The Third Army pushed harder. By April 25th, American forces had reached the Czech border. Soviet forces were simultaneously closing on Prague from the east. The race was real, the stakes were enormous, and for the first time since the halt order, Patton felt the momentum of events working in his favor rather than against him. He formally requested permission from Schaeff to advance to Prague. He submitted tactical justifications. He submitted intelligence assessments. He waited. Schaeff deliberated for 4 days. 4 days during which Soviet forces moved steadily closer to the Czech capital. 4 days during which the Czech resistance fighters inside Prague, who had launched an open uprising on May 5th against the German garrison, fought in the streets with weapons and courage and a desperate hope that American armor would appear on the western horizon before the fighting consumed them entirely. Patton sat with the authorization request on his desk and felt the 4 days pass like physical pain. On May 6th, Schaeff approved a limited advance into Czechoslovakia, not to Prague, to Pilsen, a line drawn 30 miles west of the Czech capital, close enough to see the smoke rising from the city, not close enough to reach it. Soviet forces entered Prague on May 9th. The Czech uprising had cost over 3,000 lives in 4 days of street fighting. Patton's lead elements were at Pilsen, 30 miles away. The road was open. He had the fuel. He had the tanks. He did not have the order. He stood at the edge of his forward command position on May 9th and looked east toward a horizon he was not permitted to cross. Germany had surrendered at 11:01 p.m. the previous night. The war in Europe was officially over. Patton had helped win it. He had driven further faster and destroyed more enemy forces than any commander in the Western theater. His name was already being spoken alongside the greatest military leaders in American history. And he had never felt less victorious in his life. Because somewhere in that gap between what his army could do and what his army was permitted to do, a different kind of war had been fought and lost. Not by soldiers. By diplomats in conference rooms months before the tanks ever reached the Elbe. And the consequences of those decisions, the division of Europe, the Iron Curtain that was already beginning to descend from Stettin to Trieste, would not be measured in weeks or months. They would be measured in decades. Patton returned to his command tent. On his desk was a new memorandum from Schaeff. He read the first line. Then he sat down slowly in his chair. Because the order he was now reading didn't just end the advance into Czechoslovakia. It signaled something larger. Something that would define the final chapter of his career in a way he had never anticipated. The United States Army was already drawing down. Divisions were being deactivated. Men were going home. And certain generals, it appeared, were going to be asked some very difficult questions about statements they had been making regarding the Soviet Union. The war with Germany was over. But George Patton had just started a new one. And this time, his enemy wasn't wearing a Wehrmacht uniform. Patton had stopped a Wehrmacht lieutenant colonel with 5 words and cold silence. He had driven the Third Army further and faster than any force in the history of armored warfare. He had stood at the Czech border with open road ahead and watched politics close the door on his tanks. And now, with Germany's surrender signed and the war officially over, a new memorandum was sitting on his desk that would prove more dangerous to his career than any German panzer division he had ever faced. The Soviets had been watching Patton for months, and they were not alone. Within 72 hours of Germany's surrender, on May 8, 1945, Soviet military intelligence had compiled a comprehensive assessment of the Third Army's final operational positions. The document, portions of which were declassified decades later, described Patton's forces in clinical terms: unit strength equipment, readiness, supply lines, fuel reserves. What the assessment also noted with particular attention was something that Soviet commanders found deeply alarming. The Third Army had not demobilized. It had not dispersed. Its armored divisions remained concentrated, supplied, and combat-ready at positions along the Czech border and inside Bavaria. No other American force in Europe was in comparable operational condition. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov, commanding Soviet forces in Germany, reportedly sent a personal message to Stalin describing Patton's army as the single most capable offensive force on the European continent as of VE Day. He was not wrong. The problem was that Patton had begun saying out loud what his military assessment already implied. Not in classified memoranda, in press conferences. On May 8, 1945, the day of Germany's formal surrender, Patton gave a briefing to American war correspondents in Bavaria. He was direct as always. He was unfiltered as always. And he said something that traveled from that briefing room to Schaeff headquarters, to the White House to Moscow within 48 hours. He suggested plainly, and without diplomatic softening, that the American army should not be demobilizing. That the Soviet Union represented a fundamental threat to the freedom of every nation in Central and Eastern Europe. That the time to address that threat was now, while American forces were in position before the Red Army consolidated control of the territories it had occupied. He did not use careful language. He rarely did. Schaeff reacted immediately. A formal reprimand was drafted. Eisenhower summoned Patton and told him with the particular exhaustion of a man who had delivered this message before that he needed to stop talking about the Soviet Union. That the political situation was delicate. That the alliance had to be maintained. That Patton's role was military, not diplomatic, and he was to restrict his public statements accordingly. Patton sat across from Eisenhower and listened. Then he said, "Ike, in 10 years you're going to wish someone had listened." Eisenhower looked at him for a long moment. "George," he said quietly, "you may be right, but that is not the point." It was not the last such conversation. Through the summer of 1945, Patton continued to command the Third Army, and then briefly the 15th Army, a largely administrative command focused on writing the history of the European campaign. He continued to make statements. He compared Nazi Party members to American Democrats and Republicans, meaning that ordinary membership in a political party should not disqualify a person from participating in post-war German administration. The comparison was catastrophically ill-chosen. The resulting firestorm forced Eisenhower's hand. On October 2, 1945, Eisenhower relieved Patton of command of the Third Army. The fastest army in the history of warfare would now be commanded by someone else. Patton was reassigned to the 15th Army. It was in every practical sense a professional death sentence for a man who lived to command combat forces. He accepted it. He did not go quietly internally. His letters from this period burned with frustration, but he accepted it publicly because he understood the institutional reality even when he despised it. He threw himself into the historical documentation work with the same intensity he brought to everything. He began planning a return to the United States. He talked about retirement. He talked about writing. He was 59 years old and had commanded the most successful army in American military history, and had been removed from that command for saying things that within 5 years would be described as prophetic by almost everyone in Washington. On December 8, 1945, Patton went hunting near Mannheim, Germany. It was a gray Sunday morning, cold and clear. He was riding in a staff car with General Hobart Gay along a quiet road outside the city, when a military truck made a slow, low-speed turn and struck the car at an intersection. The collision was minor by any mechanical standard. Both vehicles were moving slowly. No one else in either vehicle was seriously injured. The truck driver walked away. General Gay walked away. Patton did not walk away. The impact threw him forward. He struck the partition between the front and rear seats of the car. The injury was to his neck a fracture and dislocation at the third and fourth cervical vertebrae. He was paralyzed from the shoulders down immediately. He was fully conscious. He told the men around him he could not move his arms and instructed them to call for medical support. His composure in the first minutes after the accident was, according to every account, absolute. He was transported to the 131st Station Hospital in Heidelberg. The finest neurosurgical team available in the European theater was assembled. For the next 12 days, the man who had crossed the Rhine, broken out of Normandy, relieved Bastogne, and driven 900 miles across the heart of Europe, lay in a hospital bed in Heidelberg paralyzed, surrounded by medical equipment, receiving visitors who came to say things that sounded very much like goodbyes. He was clear-minded throughout. He talked. He read. He dictated. He told Beatrice, his wife, who flew from America immediately, that he didn't think he was going to make it, and that she shouldn't be sad about it. He had, he said, lived more completely than most men dream of. He had done what he was built to do. The medical situation did not improve. The spinal injury was severe, and complications from what appears to have been a pulmonary embolism developed in the final days. On December 21, 1945, at 5:45 in the afternoon, George Smith Patton, Jr. died quietly in Heidelberg. He was 59 years old. He had survived Kasserine Pass, the hedgerows of Normandy, the Bulge, the Rhine crossing, and 3 years of the most intense armored combat in human history. He was killed by a slow-speed traffic accident on a quiet road 13 days after Germany had been at peace for 7 months. His body was transported to Luxembourg, where he was buried among the men of the Third Army at the American Military Cemetery at Ham. He had requested it specifically. He had said with characteristic simplicity that he wanted to be with his soldiers. Over 5,000 American servicemen were buried in that cemetery. Patton was placed among them, not apart from them. His grave marker was identical to theirs. The reaction across the Allied world was enormous and immediate. Tributes arrived from every corner. Winston Churchill called him the most brilliant battlefield commander produced by the English-speaking world in the entire war. Omar Bradley, who had clashed with him repeatedly and managed him with extraordinary patience, wrote that America had lost its greatest combat soldier. Eisenhower, visibly moved at the news, said that Patton had been irreplaceable in the qualities that made great armies move. From the Soviet side, there was silence. Official Soviet military communiques did not mention his death. Soviet newspapers gave it minimal coverage. Whether this silence reflected genuine indifference or something more calculated has been debated by historians ever since. What was not debated was the operational record he left behind. The Third Army between August 1, 1944 and May 9, 1945 had liberated or captured 81,522 square miles of territory across France, Luxembourg, Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. It had killed, wounded, or captured 1,811,388 German soldiers. It had crossed 24 major rivers. It had liberated more than 12,000 towns and cities. It had accomplished all of this at a rate of advance that military historians still struggle to contextualize within normal frameworks of armored warfare. Patton's Third Army had operated at a tempo that German commanders repeatedly described in post-war interrogations as incomprehensible. Not fast. Incomprehensible. Wehrmacht officers who had fought on the Eastern Front against Soviet forces that attacked in massive human waves with enormous material support said that they had never experienced anything that prepared them for the pace at which Patton moved. He broke the conventional calculus of what armies could do. He moved before the enemy expected movement. He struck before the enemy had finished analyzing the previous strike. He never allowed the tempo to slow to a level where German commanders could stabilize a defensive line. The man in the prisoner compound near Weimar on April 14th, Friedrich von Ahlenorf, standing in the mud with his monocle and his oak leaves and his 16 years of Wehrmacht service, had called American soldiers shopkeepers in uniform. It was a phrase Patton would have appreciated in a dark way, because it contained exactly the kind of institutional arrogance that he had spent his career weaponizing against its holders. The Wehrmacht believed in the supremacy of military tradition, rank doctrine, and form. Patton believed in speed, surprise, violence of action, and getting to the other side of the problem before the enemy understood there was a problem. One of those philosophies now lay buried in a cemetery in Luxembourg. The other had produced a graveyard that stretched across half of Europe. The legacy question, though the question Patton himself had raised in press conferences and been punished for raising, did not resolve quickly. Within 5 years of his death, the Cold War had divided Europe precisely along the lines he had predicted. The Iron Curtain. Churchill's phrase descended from Stettin to Trieste, in almost exact correspondence to where Patton had argued the West needed to be more forceful. The countries his Third Army had liberated from Nazi occupation, but not been permitted to hold Czechoslovakia. Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria fell into Soviet-dominated governments within 3 years of the war's end. Prague, the city. Patton had been stopped 30 miles from reaching, would not see a free election for 44 years. Whether Patton's proposed approach would have changed that outcome is a question historians still argue. The logistical and political complications would have been enormous. The Soviet Union had suffered 27 million casualties in the war. The alliance was real, even if it was temporary. The Americans were exhausted and wanted to come home. The idea that American public opinion in 1945 would have supported continued military confrontation with a wartime ally is at minimum questionable. But the argument he made that the geographic and political situation of post-war Europe was being determined in real time by where armies stood in the spring of 1945, and that America was choosing not to maximize its position, was not wrong. It was simply unwelcome. And in 1945, as in 1945's prisoner compound near Weimar, unwelcome reality had a way of arriving whether you prepared for it or not. The soldier who had forced one man to face reality had not been able to force an institution to do the same. That gap between what Patton could do on a battlefield and what he could not do in a conference room is perhaps the central story of his final year. He is buried in Luxembourg, surrounded by his soldiers. The grave marker says exactly what every other marker in that cemetery says: rank, name, state, date. The rank that mattered in the end was the one carved in stone. From a muddy prisoner compound near Weimar, where one general dismantled an arrogant officer's last illusion with 5 seconds of cold silence to the banks of the Mulda River, where politics stopped the fastest army in history to a quiet road outside Mannheim. Where everything ended, the story of George Patton is not simply a story about a general who won battles. It is a story about what happens when a man who understands reality perfectly is surrounded by institutions that prefer a more comfortable version of it. We asked what happened to the man behind the legend. The answer is more complicated and more human than the mythology suggests. And it ends with a detail that almost no one knows. Patton died on December 21, 1945 at 5:45 in the afternoon in a hospital room in Heidelberg. He had been paralyzed for 13 days following a low-speed traffic accident that by every mechanical measure should not have killed anyone. The truck driver walked away. His passenger walked away. Patton, who had survived artillery barrages in North Africa, tank battles in France, and the entire compressed catastrophe of the Western Campaign, died from the physics of a slow turn at an intersection. Beatrice was with him at the end. She had flown from America within days of the accident, and she stayed. They had been married for 35 years. She had followed him across every posting, every assignment, every controversy. She knew better than anyone the distance between the public figure, the ivory-handled revolvers, the theatrical confidence, the volcanic public persona, and the private man who wrote poetry, who wept at the graves of his soldiers, who genuinely believed that he had lived previous lives as a warrior and was simply completing an obligation that predated his current body. In his final conscious days, Patton told Beatrice that he was not afraid. He told her that he was tired, which was perhaps the most honest thing he had said publicly in years, because the exhaustion was real and had been building since long before the accident. He was tired of the politics, tired of being managed, tired of watching the post-war settlement take shape in ways that confirmed his worst predictions, while simultaneously punishing him for making those predictions out loud. He was buried in Luxembourg, at the American Military Cemetery at Ham, among 5,000 of the soldiers his army had spent 10 months fighting beside. He had requested this specifically. The grave marker was regulation identical to every other marker in that cemetery. Rank, name, state, date. Nothing more. For a man who had lived his entire public life in maximum contrast, the loudest voice, the most decorated uniform, the most aggressively individual personality in the American military, there was something deliberately simple about that ending. He did not want a monument. He wanted to be where his soldiers were. The men who had served under him did not forget quickly. Third Army veterans formed associations that maintained active membership for decades. They named streets and parks and schools. They came to Luxembourg on anniversaries and stood at that grave marker and remembered things that could not be adequately explained to people who had not been there. The particular quality of movement that Patton demanded from his army, the sense that with him in command, the impossible was merely the next hour's objective. Friedrich von Ahlenorf, the German officer whose confrontation with Patton in that prisoner compound had set this story in motion, survived the war and was released from American custody in 1946. He returned to what remained of Germany and eventually settled in Bavaria. Declassified records indicate he was interviewed by American military historians in 1952 as part of a comprehensive program to document German officers' perspectives on American commanders. When asked about Patton specifically, he reportedly said through a translator that Patton was the only American general he had encountered who thought the way German officers were trained to think aggressively continuously, with contempt for the defensive. He meant it as a compliment. He gave it 7 years after standing in a muddy compound and calling American soldiers shopkeepers in uniform. Reality has a long correction cycle, but it is thorough. The operational legacy of the Third Army was immediate and total in its influence on post-war American military doctrine. The speed and tempo of Patton's advance became the foundational model for armored warfare planning throughout the Cold War. Every NATO doctrine developed between 1947 and 1991 for defending Western Europe against a Soviet armored thrust incorporated the core principles Patton had demonstrated operationally. Continuous pressure, deep exploitation, maintaining momentum beyond the point where the enemy expected you to pause. The air-land battle doctrine, formalized by the U.S. Army in 1982 and considered the definitive framework for the NATO-Soviet confrontation that never became a shooting war, was at its conceptual core. Patton's Third Army operational method, systematized into formal doctrine. When American armored forces drove into Iraq in 1991, the performance that stunned military observers worldwide, the speed, the depth of penetration, the complete collapse of Iraqi defensive positions that commanders had expected to hold for weeks, was described by General Norman Schwarzkopf in explicitly Pattonian terms. The left hook through the Iraqi desert. The flanking movement that bypassed prepared defenses and struck deep into the enemy's operational rear was a direct descendant of the Third Army's operational philosophy. The ground war lasted 100 hours. Military historians noted the lineage immediately. The total operational record of the Third Army between August 1944 and May 1945 stands as a statistical argument that is difficult to engage with skeptically. Over 1.8 million German soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. 81,000 square miles of territory liberated. 24 major river crossings. All achieved at a casualty rate significantly lower proportionally than comparable Allied formations conducting less aggressive operations. The paradox that Patton understood, and that military historians have confirmed repeatedly, is that speed and aggression counterintuitively save lives. Your own lives, because they collapse the enemy's ability to organize effective resistance before it can be mounted. The army that moves faster than the enemy can think is the army that wins at the lowest cost. The lesson is not purely military. The confrontation in that prisoner compound on April 14, 1945, contained something that extends well beyond the tactical situation. Von Allendorf's refusal to step forward was not stupidity. He was not a stupid man. It was the behavior of someone whose entire identity had been constructed around a hierarchy that had just ceased to exist, and who could not process the collapse of that hierarchy, because accepting it meant accepting the collapse of everything he understood himself to be. Rank had meant everything, therefore rank still meant something. The logic was internally consistent and completely disconnected from reality. Patton's response was not rage. It was patience deployed as a weapon. He gave the man the facts. He gave him the numbers. He gave him 5 seconds and the dignity of making his own choice. And when Allendorf finally moved, when the monocle came out and the shoulders dropped and the boots began moving through the mud toward the processing table, Patton did not gloat. He waited. And then he said the thing that mattered in my army rank means responsibility. In yours, it meant privilege. That distinction was not just a diagnosis of the Wehrmacht. It was a diagnosis of every institution that mistakes authority for accountability, every hierarchy that protects its own structure at the expense of its purpose. Organizations fail this way regularly. Armies fail this way. Companies fail this way. The institution that cannot distinguish between the rank that earns deference and the performance that deserves it is the institution that is already losing whether or not it has received the news yet. Now the detail that almost no one knows. Among Patton's personal effects catalogued after his death and held by the Patton family was a small journal he had kept intermittently during the final months of the European campaign. The journal was not a military document. It contained no operational details, no tactical assessments, nothing of the kind that military historians typically mine from such sources. It was personal. Observations. Reflections. Fragments that never made it into official correspondence because they were too honest for official correspondence. One entry dated April 15, 1945, the day after the confrontation in the prisoner compound near Weimar, contained a passage that Patton family members shared with a biographer in the 1990s. Patton wrote in his characteristically compressed style that he had met a German officer the previous day who reminded him of himself 20 years earlier. Not in ideology, not in politics, but in the conviction that the structure a man inhabits is the same thing as the truth about the world. He wrote that it had taken him most of his career to understand that those were different things, that the army was not the war, that rank was not judgment, that the map was not the ground. He wrote, "He'll figure it out. They all do eventually, the ones who survive long enough." It is impossible to know exactly what Patton meant by that final line, whether he was talking about von Allendorf specifically, or about all the officers on both sides who had built their self-understanding around institutions that the war had destroyed, or about something more personal about himself, about the career that was already ending in ways he could feel but not yet articulate. What is certain is this: a man who drove 900 miles across the heart of Europe, who crossed the Rhine and relieved Bastogne, and stood at the Czech border with open road ahead, spent his final weeks not on a battlefield, but in a hospital room in Heidelberg, thinking about the difference between the structures we build to organize power and the reality those structures are supposed to serve. He understood it. He had always understood it. He had demonstrated it publicly and without apology in a muddy prisoner compound on a cold April morning, with 5 seconds and the particular calm of a man who has nothing left to prove. From a prisoner compound in the ruins of Germany to the doctrines that shaped 50 years of American military power, from ivory-handled revolvers to a regulation grave marker in Luxembourg, George Patton proved that the most dangerous weapon any leader carries is not a tank, not an army, not a rank. It is the willingness to say what is true when everyone around you is still deciding whether truth is convenient. He did not live to see how right he was, but the ground he stood on and the men he stood with and the reality he refused to soften, they outlasted everything else. They always do.